My name is Rachel Whitmore. I am 38 years old. While I was standing at my brother's grave in Houston, Texas, saying the only goodbye I would ever get to say, his wife was at the house changing the locks, and by the time my parents drove back from the funeral, their clothes were in garbage bags on the front porch of the home my father's $40,000 helped pay for, and the woman who put them there told my 67-year-old father, a man who spent 31 years as a master electrician wiring buildings across Brazos County, that he had until dark to get off her property. My mother stood behind him on that porch holding a grocery bag full of picture frames, and she didn't say a word. She just looked at the door she used to walk through every morning to make breakfast for a woman who had already decided she was worthless. Take a second to like and subscribe, because what my sister-in-law said to my mother through that locked door, while my brother's body was still at the funeral home, is the reason I am standing here telling you this story today. And let me tell you how all of this started, because sometimes the people who eat at your mother's table every night are the same ones counting down the days until they can throw the table away. My brother, Tyler Whitmore, 42 years old, a senior financial analyst at Carney and Pratt Capital in Houston, the kind of man who noticed what most people missed, and who kept quiet when he could have spoken, and who loved our parents with the kind of devotion that shows up in what you do, not what you say, called me on a Tuesday night, a few minutes past 3 a.m, his voice thin and stretched in a way I had never heard from him, and all he managed to say was my name and something about pressure in his chest before the line cut out. By the time I made the 90-mile drive from Bryan to Houston, speeding down Highway 6 in the dark with my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white, my brother was already gone. Massive cardiac event, the doctor said, with the steady, clinical voice of a man who delivers that kind of news more often than anyone should have to. My sister-in-law, Brooke Whitmore, 40 years old, a licensed interior designer who ran her own studio in the Montrose neighborhood, which gave her a trained eye for knowing the value of every surface she touched, stood beside me in that waiting area with a tissue pressed to her face, and for one terrible second, I caught something behind her eyes that was not grief, something that looked closer to calculation. And I told myself I was wrong, because no one could stand next to their husband's body and think about anything except loss. The funeral was 3 days later, and my sister-in-law arranged every detail with the precision of someone who stages showrooms for a living. Flowers in the right shade of white, music my brother would have chosen, programs printed on heavy cardstock with his photographs centered perfectly. And everything was so carefully orchestrated that the grief itself almost felt curated. I was standing at the back of the reception hall, holding a glass of sweet tea I could not bring myself to drink, when I heard her voice coming from behind the flower arrangements, low and quick and entirely without sorrow, telling her sister that the life insurance alone would carry the mortgage for 2 full years, and that without the extra expenses, everything was going to work out better than expected. Her sister asked about my parents. Where would they go? What would happen to them? And my sister-in-law laughed, and I need you to understand the sound of that laugh, because it was sharp and hollow and quick, like a door being closed on a conversation that was already over. And she said, "That is not my problem anymore. They can figure it out the way every other grown person does." I kept thinking about my mother's hands, the way she had folded them in the front pew during the service, pressing them flat against her thighs as if she could hold herself together by keeping perfectly still. And now someone 10 feet away was laughing about whether she had somewhere to sleep tonight. My parents had been living in that house for 2 years. They had sold their own home, The house my father wired himself when he was 30, the house where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where my mother ran her alterations business out of the back room, and they gave my brother and his wife $40,000 for the down payment, and they moved in with the understanding that it was temporary, just until they found something smaller and more manageable for their age. But temporary became a routine, and the routine became a life, and my parents had settled into being useful. My father fixing things, my mother cooking dinner every single night, both of them believing they were part of a family that wanted them there. When my parents drove home from the funeral in their 10-year-old Buick, the garage door did not open. My father tried his key at the front door, and the lock would not turn. My mother was the one who noticed the bags, 3 black garbage bags lined along the porch railing, stuffed with their clothes, their shoes, the quilt my mother had sewn the year she retired. When my sister-in-law finally opened the door, just wide enough to speak through the gap, she told my father the house was in my brother's name and it belonged to her now, and that she needed space, and that their living there was no longer going to work. My father stood on that porch in his good suit, the one my mother had pressed that morning for the funeral of his only son, and he asked where they were supposed to go. And my sister-in-law said, without blinking, "You will figure it out. You are both adults." And then she added the part that I will never be able to unhear, the words my mother has never repeated out loud, but that I know she carries with her every single day. Your son felt sorry for you. I don't. My mother did not cry. She picked up 2 of the garbage bags, 1 in each hand, and walked to the car. And she loaded them into the back seat the way she used to load fabric bolts into the back of her station wagon when she was running her shop. Efficient, quiet, her back straight. My father stood on that porch for another half a minute, looking at the door. And then he picked up the 3rd bag and the grocery sack full of picture frames and followed her without a word. I drove behind them to the Hampton Inn on Route 6 because it was the closest place I could find with a room available. And I helped my father carry everything upstairs, and when I set the last bag on the floor of that room that smelled like industrial cleaner and someone else's bad luck, I looked at my parents sitting side by side on the edge of that polyester bedspread, my father's hands folded between his knees, my mother's eyes fixed on a stain in the carpet. And something inside me shifted into a place I had never been before. Something that was not grief and not anger, but something quieter and more permanent. Something that felt like a decision being made, before I even understood what the decision was. But before I tell you what happened in the weeks that followed, I need you to understand who was sitting on that bed. Because you cannot feel the full weight of what was taken unless you know what those 2 people built with their lives. My father, Glenn Whitmore, 67 years old, a retired master electrician who spent 31 years with IBEW, Local 520 out of Bryan, Texas, was a man who measured his worth by what he could build with his hands. He started pulling wire at 20, earned his journeyman's license by 24, made master by 28, and spent the next 3 decades wiring commercial buildings, hospitals, schools, and homes across Brazos County and half the towns between Bryan and Houston. Not once in 31 years did he fail a single code inspection. His hands were thick-knuckled and scarred from wire pulls, the calluses so deep they never softened even after he retired. And he wore the same thing every day of his life: clean Wrangler jeans, a tucked-in button-down shirt, and steel-toed boots he kept polished out of habit, even though nobody was inspecting him anymore. Every morning at 5:45, without fail, my father made coffee. The same way, the same pot, 2 cups. And he set my mother's cup on the counter with a folded paper napkin underneath it, even though she had told him 1,000 times she did not need the napkin. He did it anyway, every single morning, because that is who my father is. A man who believes that small things done consistently are what hold a life together. My mother, Connie Whitmore, 65, a retired alteration specialist who ran a small tailoring shop on Main Street in Bryan for 22 years, was a woman who could look at a torn seam and see something worth saving. Her hands were small and precise and always moving, folding something, smoothing something, fixing something that nobody else had noticed needed fixing. She wore a sterling silver thimble ring on her right hand even years after she closed the shop for good, and she kept a sewing kit in her purse everywhere she went. If she spotted a loose button on a stranger's coat in line at the H-E-B, she would fix it right there in the checkout line with a needle between her teeth and a look of quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with praise and everything to do with purpose. When my brother bought that house with his wife, my parents sold the home my father had wired himself, the house where I grew up, where my mother's shop took up the back room with bolts of fabric stacked to the ceiling and the sound of her sewing machine running until 9 o'clock every night. They sold that home and handed over $40,000 for the down payment, and they moved in believing it was temporary until they found something smaller. My mother gave up her shop, her income, her craft, the place where she spent 22 years being needed, and she told me it was time to slow down. But I heard the way her voice caught on that last word, and I knew it cost her something she never talked about. My father rewired the entire house that first summer. 3 weekends crawling through attic insulation in August heat, saving them somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 in contractor fees. And my sister-in-law never once thanked him. My mother sewed new curtains for every room, hand-measured and hand-stitched to match the exact color palette my sister-in-law had chosen. And within 6 months, every one of those curtains was gone, replaced by store-bought drapes that cost more than my mother's monthly Social Security check. My mother cooked dinner for that household every single night for 2 years. She learned my sister-in-law's dietary preferences, gluten-free, dairy-free, and adjusted every recipe without a word of complaint. And when my sister-in-law told her one evening that her chicken salad was not really what we eat in this house, my mother nodded, scraped the entire bowl into the trash, and asked what she would prefer instead. That night I called my parents, and my father answered. And when I asked where my mother was, he was quiet for a long time and then said, "She is in her room, sweetheart." I asked if she was reading, and he said, "No, she is just sitting." My father took a part-time maintenance job at a church down the road, not because he needed the money, but because he did not want to feel like a burden. And he gave every paycheck to my mother so she could buy groceries for the household without having to ask anyone for anything. The day my sister-in-law told him his boots were tracking dirt into her house, my father went to the garage, took off his boots, cleaned the floor himself on his hands and knees with a rag, and walked back inside in his socks without saying a word. I did not find out about that until weeks later, when my mother mentioned it in passing as though it were nothing, as though a 67-year-old man getting on his knees to clean a floor because someone was embarrassed by his work boots was just an ordinary thing that happened on a Tuesday afternoon. What I did not know until after the funeral was that my sister-in-law had been removing my parents' photographs from the house for months, one frame at a time, quietly, replacing family pictures with prints she had bought at a design market in Houston. My mother noticed, but she never said anything, because she was raised to believe you do not make trouble in someone else's home, even when that home was built on the money you gave them. And I think most of us know someone like that. Someone who gives everything they have and asks for nothing back, who sits in silence when they should be shouting, because they were raised to believe that being good means being quiet. If you know that person, you know my parents, and you understand why what happened to them is the kind of thing that changes how you look at the people sitting at your own table. These are the people my sister-in-law put on a motel bed with their clothes in garbage bags. A master electrician who wired half the county, and a seamstress who could fix anything with her hands, sitting in a room that cost $79 a night, surrounded by everything they had left in the world. The Hampton Inn was never meant to be more than a night or two, but one night turned into a week, and a week turned into something that started to feel permanent in the worst possible way. I drove to see my parents every evening after my shift at the Brazos Valley Community Health Center, 90 miles round trip on Highway 6. And every evening I found the same scene. My father sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the parking lot. My mother folding and refolding clothes that were already folded, neither of them complaining, both of them pretending that a $79 room with stained carpet and a view of a Denny's dumpster was somehow fine. My father never said a word against anyone. He sat in that chair with his back straight and his hands folded and said, "Sweetheart, this is temporary. We will figure it out." And the steadiness in his voice, the same tone he used when he was running a job site and something had gone wrong and 20 men were looking at him to tell them what to do next, made me want to walk out of the room so he would not see me cry. Because the strongest man I had ever known was sitting in a budget motel spending his pension check on a room he should never have had to rent. My mother kept her sewing kit on the nightstand. She had nothing to sew, no one to fix anything for, but the kit stayed there, open, the silver thimble ring sitting on top of it like a small monument to a life that no longer had a use for her. She straightened the room every morning before the housekeeper arrived, because that was the kind of woman my mother was. She took care of someone else's space because she no longer had a space of her own. 2 weeks into that hotel stay, I received a phone call from a woman who lived 3 houses down from my brother's old home. She introduced herself politely and said she was calling because she had heard from my sister-in-law that my father was having memory problems, and she wanted to give me the name of a memory care facility in Brazos County that had been well reviewed. I held the phone away from my face because I did not trust what I might say if I kept it close. My father did not have memory problems. My father was the sharpest person I had ever known. A man who could look at a set of blueprints from 1994 and tell you which wire gauge was pulled on which circuit. A man who quoted National Electrical Code revisions year by year the way other men recite baseball statistics. And my sister-in-law had told this woman, and apparently every other person on that block, that he was losing his mind. All I could think was, this is a man who never once failed a code inspection in 31 years, who wired 300 buildings and signed off on every single one with his own name. And the woman he welcomed into his family is out there telling the neighborhood he does not know where he is. She was not just putting my parents out. She was making them smaller, making them less real, making them into people that no one would believe if they ever tried to tell the truth about what happened in that house. The neighbor on the phone was asking me if I wanted the name of a good memory care facility for my father, a man who wired 300 buildings without a single code violation because my sister-in-law had told everyone on the block he was losing his mind. If you have ever watched someone try to erase a person you love while that person is still standing, tell me what you would have done. Like and subscribe. Because the letter I found 3 weeks later in a safety deposit box proved that my brother had already seen everything. I did not tell my parents about the phone call. My mother would have been gutted by the humiliation, and my father would have driven straight to that house and stood on the porch and demanded an explanation from a woman who had already decided he was nothing. And the last thing I wanted was for him to stand on a doorstep where he was no longer welcome and ask someone who did not respect him to explain why she was lying about his mind. So I swallowed it. I went to work the next morning and treated patients at the community health center who had less than my parents and more fight in them than I felt. And I drove home in the dark and sat in my car outside the hotel and stared at the building where my parents were sleeping and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do. Their savings were running thin. $79 a night adds up fast when you are living on a master electrician's pension and a Social Security check that was designed to supplement a life, not replace one. I spent my evenings looking at apartments online, one-bedroom units in Bryan that my parents could afford, and every listing felt like a smaller and smaller box closing around two people who had already spent their whole lives building things for other people. And my mother would sit in a place with no kitchen to cook in and no counter to leave her sewing kit on, and my father would sit in a chair by another window in another room with nothing to fix and no one asking him to. And then, on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the funeral, my phone rang, and the voice on the other end belonged to a man I had never met. And he said he was my brother's attorney and that my presence was specifically required at a formal reading of my brother's will. The attorney's name was Robert Calloway, 62 years old, a solo estate attorney who had been handling wills and trusts in Brazos County for over 30 years, the kind of lawyer who still shook your hand and looked you in the eye when he had something important to say. He told me the probate process was moving through and that the formal reading was set for the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. I asked him if he was certain I was supposed to be there, because my sister-in-law had made it very clear that my brother would not have left anything for his family outside of her. He paused, and his pause had weight. And then he said, "Ms. Whitmore, your brother was very specific about what he wanted." I arrived at the law office on Tuesday at 1:45 and sat in my car watching my sister-in-law step out of a silver BMW in a black dress that looked like it cost more than my parents' monthly hotel bill. She had brought someone, her sister, Paige Langford, 37, an associate attorney at a mid-size firm in Houston, which meant my sister-in-law had shown up to a will reading with her own legal counsel. And that told me everything I needed to know about what she expected to happen inside that room. When I walked into the reception area, my sister-in-law looked at me the way you look at a bill you thought you had already taken care of, and she said to the receptionist, "What is she doing here?" The young woman answered, "Ms. Whitmore is here for the will reading," and the question of which Ms. Whitmore hung in the air for a second before my sister-in-law's sister leaned over and whispered something in her ear, and they took seats on the far side of the waiting room without another word. The attorney appeared at 2 o'clock and brought us into an office with mahogany furniture and shelves lined with legal volumes, and the kind of deep quiet that only exists in rooms where people go to hear things they are not ready for. He sat behind his desk and said that my brother had been very specific about his wishes and that he would read the will in full. The first portion was exactly what I expected and exactly what my sister-in-law had been counting on. She inherited the house, the cars, my brother's retirement accounts, and his life insurance policy. And she sat there nodding at each item with the satisfied expression of someone who is being told she already owns what she has spent years planning to take. Her sister made notes on a legal pad, and my sister-in-law glanced at me after each provision with a look that was very close to satisfaction. And then the attorney's voice shifted, just slightly, the way a room shifts when someone opens a window. And he said, "There is one final provision that your brother added 3 months ago." My sister-in-law stopped nodding. Her sister put down her pen, and I held my breath. The provision stated that my brother had maintained a safety deposit box at First Guarantee Bank, and that the contents of that box, along with all documentation and account information, were to go to me. My sister-in-law's voice went sharp and high. "What safety deposit box? He never mentioned any safety deposit box." The attorney looked at her over the top of his glasses and said, "Apparently it was something he maintained privately. He was fully competent when he added this provision, and I witnessed the signing myself." Her sister began scribbling faster. My sister-in-law said she would challenge it. The attorney said she was welcome to try. I asked when my brother had made this addition. The attorney checked his notes. February 15th. I remembered that date, the day after Valentine's Day, and my brother had been unusually quiet at dinner that evening, barely speaking while my sister-in-law complained about something I cannot even remember now. Something had happened on that date that sent my brother to a lawyer's office to change his will. In the parking lot afterward, my sister-in-law cornered me beside my car and said we should share whatever was in the box, that families should work together, that my brother would have wanted his wife to benefit from everything he left behind. I looked at her standing there in her designer dress beside her silver car, with $200,000 of life insurance already deposited, and I said, "I suppose we will find out next week." And I think anyone who has ever been underestimated by someone who thought they had already won knows the quiet that settles inside you at a moment like that. When you do not know what is coming, but you know the person in front of you is about to discover they made a serious mistake. Over the weekend, while the bank processed the paperwork, I tried to imagine what my brother had put in that safety deposit box. A keepsake, probably. My father's old watch, maybe some photo albums from our childhood. Something small and personal that he wanted to make sure survived. My brother had never been a man of dramatic gestures. He was a financial analyst, a man of spreadsheets and quiet projections and careful planning, and I assumed whatever he had left me would be modest and sentimental and exactly like him. I had no idea how wrong I was. 3 business days later, I walked into First Guarantee Bank carrying the sealed envelope and a copy of my brother's death certificate, and everything about the weight of that paper in my hand felt heavier than it should have. The branch manager, Sandra Hewitt, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes who had clearly been told something about my situation, escorted me to the vault personally and said, "Box E3D7 is one of our larger units. Your brother rented it about 5 years ago, and he visited quite regularly." 5 years. My brother had been maintaining something in this bank for 5 years, and the regularity of his visits told me this was not a keepsake box. This was something he had been building. She used her master key, I used my brother's, and the box slid out heavy and smooth. She showed me to a private viewing room, told me to take whatever time I needed, and closed the door. The first thing I saw was a letter in my brother's handwriting. Steady, precise, the handwriting of a man who checked his own work twice before signing anything. It was addressed to me by the name he had called me since we were children. It said, "If you are reading this, then I am gone. And Brooke has probably shown you who she really is. I am sorry for that, but I am not surprised. I have known for years what kind of person I married, and I have been preparing for this." He wrote that our parents gave them $40,000 for the down payment, and that he never forgot it was a promise, not a gift, and that he had been investing that money for 5 years, adding to it whenever he could. The accounts, he said, were all in my name. I set the letter down, and my hands would not stop shaking. Underneath were bank statements, investment portfolios, account summaries, all of them bearing my name, all of them showing balances I had to read 3 times to believe. $185,000 across multiple investment accounts, grown carefully over 5 years by a man who spent his professional life knowing exactly where to put money so it would work while everyone else was sleeping. My brother had turned our parents' sacrifice into a safety net that no one could cut. But the money was not the part that made me sit in that small room for nearly an hour without moving. Beneath the financial documents was a folder labeled Documentation. And what was inside that folder changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. My brother had saved it all. Every text message my sister-in-law had ever sent about our parents, calling my mother that old woman with the sewing machine, calling my father a burden we never asked for, telling her sister how easy it was to make them feel unwanted so they would eventually leave on their own. Every email chain between my sister-in-law and her sister discussing the parent situation, including specific plans for after my brother was no longer in the way. And then I found the thread that stopped my breathing. 4 emails sent between my sister-in-law and her sister, in which they discussed having my father declared mentally incompetent so they could petition for guardianship and gain access to his pension and my mother's Social Security benefits. They had researched attorneys. They had discussed which Brazos County judge might be sympathetic. They had a timeline. I sat in that room with my brother's steady handwriting in front of me, and a folder full of proof that the woman he married had been planning to erase my father from his own life. Not just throw him out of a house, but take away his right to make decisions about his own money, his own future, his own mind. All I could think was, my father wired 300 buildings. His hands built things that will stand for 50 years after he is gone. And this woman wanted a judge to sign a piece of paper saying those hands could not be trusted to sign a check. That thought sat in my chest like something I could not swallow, and I did not try. My brother's handwriting on that letter was steady and calm, the way he always was. And the words said she tried to have your father declared incompetent so she could take his pension. If that put something cold in your chest, the way it put something cold in mine, just leave a heart below. like and subscribe. Because the folder underneath that letter contained 5 years of proof that my sister-in-law had been planning this long before my brother's heart gave out. The last document in the folder explained everything else. My brother had discovered, 3 months before he died, that my sister-in-law had been intercepting our parents' mail. She rented a P.O. box under her name and rerouted their pension statements and Social Security correspondence for 2 months without their knowledge. My parents never noticed because they trusted my brother to handle whatever came to the house, and they had no reason to believe the mail was simply not arriving. That discovery, the redirected mail, the scope of the scheme, the coldness of it, was what sent my brother to the attorney's office on February 15th to quietly change his will. He did not confront her. He did not leave her. He built us a wall she could not see and could not climb. And he did it the same way he did everything, without raising his voice. The folder also contained credit card statements showing that in the month before my brother died, my sister-in-law charged over $15,000 in personal expenses, spa treatments, designer clothing, a weekend in New York with her sister, all while telling my brother they needed to cut household spending and suggesting, more than once, that our parents were the reason money was tight. I walked out of that bank carrying a folder that could dismantle my sister-in-law's entire world. And I sat in my car in the parking lot with the engine off and my hands on the wheel. And for the first time since my brother died, I did not feel helpless. I felt certain. And what I was certain of was that my parents were never going to sit in a motel room again. That night, I sat at the kitchen table in my apartment in Bryan with every document spread out like a case file, because that is exactly what it was. 5 years of evidence compiled by a man who loved his family enough to plan for the worst thing he could imagine, which was not his own death, but the possibility that the person closest to him would use it to hurt the people he loved most. I read every page, every email, every screenshot, every statement. I read the text where my sister-in-law told her sister that my mother's sewing kit was pathetic. She sits there with that stupid little kit like she is still useful. And I closed the folder and pressed both hands over my face and stayed that way for a long time. Because my mother is the most useful person I have ever known. And the thought that someone could look at a woman who spent 22 years making beautiful things with her hands and see something pathetic is a kind of cruelty that hurts worse than anything physical, because it goes after the one thing that person is most proud of. I knew what I had. I knew what that folder could do. And I knew exactly what it would cost me if I used it. If I drove to my sister-in-law's house with that evidence, the family my brother had spent his whole life holding together would be finished for good. Whatever fragile illusion remained between his wife and his parents and his sister would be gone permanently. And the memory of my brother, the man who loved everyone, who never raised his voice, who spent 5 years quietly building a safety net instead of starting a fight, would be swallowed by the ugliness of what came after. I would be the one who pulled the curtain back, and once you do that, you cannot put it up again. But if I did nothing, if I filed the folder away and helped my parents find a small apartment and let my sister-in-law keep her house and her reputation and her story about a confused old man and his inconvenient wife, then my parents would spend the rest of their lives in a one-bedroom in Bryan, believing they were the burden she told them they were. My mother would sit in a place with no kitchen to cook in and no room for her sewing machine. My father would sit in another chair by another window, a man who spent his life building things, with nothing left to build and nobody asking. I thought about my father's hands, the scars, the calluses, the way they trembled slightly when he held his coffee cup, not from weakness, but from 31 years of gripping tools heavier than most people ever lift. I thought about my mother's thimble ring and the way she wore it even with nothing to sew, as though it were a promise she had made to herself that she was not done yet. I thought about the garbage bags on the porch and the $79 room and the neighbor who called offering a memory care brochure for a man whose mind was sharper than hers would ever be. And I thought about the last line of my brother's letter, the one that stayed with me like a handprint pressed into glass. Take this money and build them a life where no one can make them feel unwanted ever again. I sat in my car outside my parents' hotel with that folder on the passenger seat, knowing that if I drove to my sister-in-law's house, I would lose every chance of ever keeping this family whole. And I thought about my mother's hands and my father's silence and the 31 years he gave to a trade that built other people's homes while someone took his. Drop a yes or no in the comments if you think I should have driven to that house. Like and subscribe. Because I turned the key in the ignition and I drove straight there. I called my sister-in-law from the car and told her I had been thinking about things, and perhaps we should sit down and talk about the safety deposit box over lunch. Her voice brightened immediately, warm and sweet and eager, the voice of someone who believes she has found an opening she can walk right through. And she said she would love that we were family, that she was so glad I was finally being reasonable about all of this. I let her believe whatever she needed to believe, because I was not going there to talk. I was going there because my parents deserved someone who would look the woman who discarded them in the face and show her exactly what she had done, documented in her own words, sent from her own phone, in her own handwriting. It was time for my sister-in-law to learn that the people you throw away are sometimes the ones who come back carrying the truth. I arrived at my sister-in-law's house at noon carrying a small gift bag and a folder that held 5 years of evidence my brother had spent his last months compiling. She answered the door in a flowing white dress, all smiles, and led me to the dining room where she had set out her wedding china and fresh-cut flowers and a pitcher of iced tea. And she talked about the weather and about grief and about family, the way someone talks about a product they are trying to get you to buy. I let her talk. I ate her food. I watched her work up to what she really wanted, which was access to whatever my brother had left me. When she finally used the word share, I set my fork down and looked at her and I said, I brought you something. I handed her the gift bag, and she unwrapped it to find a framed photograph of my brother from his college graduation, his face young and open, his smile the one I will never see again. She softened for half a second, and I said, I thought you should have it, since you are such a devoted wife. The word devoted landed exactly where I intended. And she looked up at me with sharp, wary eyes and said, What is that supposed to mean? I pulled out my phone and showed her the first screenshot, a text conversation between her and her sister, where she called my mother that old woman with the sewing machine, and laughed about how simple it was to make my parents feel like they were in the way. She grabbed for the phone and I pulled it back calmly. There are dozens more, I said. My brother saved all of it. I showed her the email about having my father declared incompetent. I showed her the credit card statements. I showed her the documentation of the rerouted mail, the P.O. box, the pension correspondence she intercepted for 2 months while my parents sat in her house trusting that everything was fine. I laid each piece of evidence on the table the way my father used to lay his tools out before starting a job. Deliberate, methodical, each one in the right place. She tried threats. He had no right to save private messages. She tried grief. She was under pressure. Everyone expected perfection. She tried money. She wanted to know how much was in the accounts. When I told her $185,000, her face went white, and she gripped the edge of the table and said the money should be part of the estate. And then I laid down the last document, the one my brother had placed at the very bottom of the folder, the one I had saved for this exact moment. A consultation receipt from a family law attorney in Houston, dated 3 months before my brother died, with my sister-in-law's name on the client line. She had been meeting with a divorce attorney. She had been preparing to leave my brother, take her share of the house, split the accounts, and walk away. My brother's death did not interrupt her plans. It improved them. A widow inherits everything. An ex-wife splits it down the middle. Her entire performance of grief, every tear, every black dress, every mention of moving forward, all of it had been delivered by a woman who was already halfway out the door before his heart stopped. The room went very still. My sister-in-law sat there with her makeup running and her hands flat on the table, and the expression of someone who has been caught not in a single lie, but in an entire life built on the certainty that no one was watching. I stood up. I said, "I am not taking you to court. You have the house, you have the insurance, you have the retirement accounts. And I have my parents. And I have the truth. And I have 185,000 reasons to make sure they never need anything from you again." She whispered, "I cannot lose everything." And I said, "You are not losing everything. You are losing the things that never belonged to you in the first place." Within 6 months, my sister-in-law's carefully staged life came apart in the way things come apart when they were never fastened to anything real. The documentation became evidence in an elder financial abuse investigation after I filed a report with Adult Protective Services in Brazos County. Her sister's firm reviewed the guardianship emails and quietly asked her to resign. The neighbors on that street, the same ones she had told my father was losing his mind, stopped answering her calls once the truth reached them, the way truth always eventually does. She kept the house, but she lost every person she had built her image for. And for a woman who measured her worth by how things looked from the outside, that was the most expensive thing she could have paid. I used my brother's investment to put a down payment on a small 3-bedroom house in Bryan, 2 miles from my clinic, with a backyard wide enough for my father to set up a proper workbench and a spare room where my mother could keep her sewing machine and her fabric bolts and her 3 clean aprons. My parents moved in on a Saturday in October, and my father spent the first weekend wiring the garage himself. Permits pulled, code followed, every connection clean. And my mother hung curtains she had sewn by hand in every window. And for the first time in months, their hands had something to do and somewhere to do it. My father's coffee pot sat on the counter by 6 the next morning, and my mother's cup was waiting for her with a folded paper napkin underneath, the way it had always been, the way it was always supposed to be. My sister-in-law kept a house built on someone else's savings, and my parents got a home built on a son's love. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a floor that looks solid and a foundation that actually holds weight. I used to believe that protecting the people you love meant keeping quiet and keeping the peace. And now I understand that sometimes it means being the person who opens the folder and lets the truth land where it needs to land. Every Sunday, I drive to my parents' house, and my father makes coffee. The same way, the same pot, 2 cups with a folded paper napkin under my mother's. And my mother sits at her sewing machine in a room that belongs to her, in a home that no one will ever take. And when I walk through that front door, nobody has to wonder whether I am welcome. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And like and subscribe, because there is always someone out there watching the people who raise them be treated like they are invisible. And they need to know that standing up is never the wrong thing to do.